This episode is brought to you by SS&C Mineralware. Are you managing mineral assets and feeling overwhelmed? Unsure if you're getting paid what you're owed? SS&C Mineralware is here to simplify the management of your minerals, royalties, and non-operated working interests. Mineralware's out-of-the-box features give you the tools you need to visualize and keep track of all of your assets in one place. Mineralware lets you know in seconds where your interests are, what's active, what acreage is open for lease, and if you're getting paid what you're owed. With Mineralware, you can even automate your revenue and JIB processing and eliminate tedious manual data entry, allowing you to focus on more pressing issues. Thousands of mineral owners rely on Mineralware to keep their mineral management simple, automatic, and all in one place. Take control of your mineral assets today with SS&C Mineralware. To see a demo, you can visit their website at www.mineralware.com. That's mineralware.com.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to talk about what to do if you're approached to sell land for oil and gas facilities. And Justin, we've talked about surface use agreements and saltwater disposal facilities in past episodes, but a recent email that I got really prompted this episode because we have not talked about the concept or the option of selling a portion of your surface rights for oil and gas facilities. And so I think it would be interesting to do a deep dive here and talk about what are some of the considerations and the nuances with selling versus leasing in terms of like a surface use agreement.
It's interesting. Yeah, this person actually they were approached about a compressor station, which is certainly a consideration. And if it's surface rights, if you're in proximity to this, it's a whole different thing to think about.
Yeah, it's very different because compressor stations have a certain set of features, I'll call them, that you need to consider if you're looking at potentially selling some land to an oil company so that they can build a compressor station on that land. And it's really interesting because it becomes like a permanent situation. When we talk about all these other things like oil and gas leases and surface use agreements, while the term is usually very long because it's held by production or as long as there's producing oil and gas facilities, those agreements will be in place. But of course, when you sell something, it's a permanent situation. So you're conveying the ownership of that piece of land, in this case, to a midstream company or oil and gas company. And it's a permanent thing. There's no takebacks, right? So you have to think about what's going to happen on that land. How is it going to affect the remaining land that you're retaining and what you're using that land for? When it comes to making that decision, there's pros and cons, like everything, right? There's trade-offs. And so you need to walk through and kind of think through the specifics of your situation in terms of making that decision. And of course, before we get too far into this, I'll have to say that this information we're sharing is just really for informational purposes to get the thought process going, but really shouldn't replace advice from a competent attorney. So this is not to be construed as financial, tax, or legal advice. But with that out of the way, Justin, do you want to talk about what exactly we're talking about when we say a gas compressor station?
Yeah, so it's not something many of us think about, right? But something, if it's going to be in your backyard or nearby, you absolutely might want to think a little bit about it. These contain large compressor units, scrubbers and filters, cooling systems, piping, valves, metering equipment. They typically have sound barrier walls as we see them built in modern instances. They got access roads, people coming and going. This is an industrial facility that does some pretty heavy duty work. There's a lot of go into this, both city ordinance, sound, noise, legal. It's not just as simple as some of the other agreements we come across, Matt.
Yeah, that's right. And there are different regulations that depending on what type of compressor station it is, which this is something I learned in doing the research for this episode, in that if it is regulated at the federal level, in other words, if it's an interstate transmission pipeline, so it goes from one state to another, those types of compressor stations are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. And FERC has some specific guidelines around noise levels, the maximum noise level that a FERC regulated compressor station can have. And that is a good thing as a landowner because it means that the company is held to a certain set of standards so that the compressor station, when it's operating normally, won't be a nuisance in terms of the noise that you would hear, again, normally. Interestingly, the concept of all the different types of facilities that go into oil and gas operations, we do a little bit of a deep dive on that in episode 15, where we talk about the life cycle of an oil and gas well from when, it's permitted all the way through to when the well starts producing and the different steps that are involved. And Rob Prentice and I did a webinar recently for the National Association of Royalty Owners. So, if you want to watch that episode, if you're a member of NARO, you can go into the members section, look at the recorded webinars, and that was recorded in May of 2026. So that's a good one to watch as well. If you're not a member of NARO, definitely recommend joining. You can get an introductory membership for $25 off with the coupon code MRPodcast. And we'll link in the show notes to where you can find out more about NARO. But Justin, before we dive into the trade-offs and the considerations and all of that, this concept of selling the land is interesting. And, do you want to talk about some of the reasons maybe why they want to buy the land instead of just lease it or, have a surface use agreement?
So it is interesting that they're looking to buy it in this situation. I think many of us would think a surface use agreement if we're thinking in terms of leasing, but selling that land gives the oil and gas company full control of that land. The only thing they're limited by at that point is whatever the regulations are on them. For them, I can see from an operational standpoint, there may really be a benefit. On the mineral owner side, you got to think about it because you're giving up the control over the land and that's not yours anymore. So they're going to handle that. It's something where, Matt, if you're approached and they're looking to buy the land from you, many mineral owners may not necessarily think that leasing may be an option, but that may be an option to bring up as well if you're approached. Yeah,
that's a good point. And of course, there are pros and cons for both. And, a company may not entertain leasing. So even though maybe you want to weigh both options, a lease may be problematic for them just because of the permanent nature of these types of facilities. So like we talked about, these are something that'll be there, particularly if it's a FERC regulated pipeline that this is going to support. I would consider that to be like a 100-year asset. These types of things are going to be in place, effectively permanently, certainly beyond our lifetime. So that's where you need to consider, the different options. Because if you lease it, then you have a whole issue of, what are your heirs going to be left with, and how do they need to manage that versus selling it? It's just sort of a clean break, so to speak. And we'll talk about some of the considerations if you do sell, because I think there are important constraints that you ought to try to place on the use of that land if you can as part of that sales contract. And that's where, again, a good oil and gas attorney is really going to help you make sure that is a positive experience and that you're not setting yourself up for the next century of noise pollution and light pollution that you weren't expecting. So certainly there's also tax considerations, which we'll talk about a little bit more as well. But when you sell the land, you're dealing with long-term capital gains. Assuming you've owned the property for longer than a year, and if you've inherited that property and are able to claim a step up in basis, then you may not actually have that as large of a capital gains tax bill as you might think. And so that's definitely worth checking with your CPA to see what the potential tax implications are of selling versus leasing. Typically, when you lease a piece of property, whether it's through an oil and gas lease or a surface use agreement, the income that is generated from that is taxed as ordinary income. It's your marginal tax rate. So you have to consider, how does that fit into the overall picture as well? Because that may sway you one way or the other if they're offering both options. And then again, you have to think about a lease is sort of like a contract or a business partnership. And so if you're selling the property and you have, robust terms in there, you're really, sort of arm's length as long as they're following their end of the bargain. Whereas if you lease it, then you're basically, kind of going into business. It's like having a tenant, right, at a rental property. And so then you're having to manage that tenant and, there's more overhead and more potential headaches, I would think, with a lease versus a sale type situation. Again, depending on how you structure specifics of that contract. But, and I will say, I haven't encountered a situation where a landowner has sold surface rights for oil and gas properties. I've seen surface use agreements and saltwater disposal agreements, and obviously oil and gas leases. So this is somewhat of a less common thing, I would think, Justin. But what are your thoughts on that whole situation, and have you dealt with that before?
I haven't dealt with it before. This is actually my first time hearing about specifically a compressor station, which brings up a whole different slew of questions to ask. But at the end, if you're looking at selling the land, I think there's some pretty basic things that apply to really selling any of the properties. And in this situation, if you're not somebody who's previously received oil and gas royalties, this could come across really foreign. So understanding what it is exactly that you're selling would be really important. They're going to come to you with this agreement, but it's really on you to make sure that they've got the legal description as it should be. Are you selling just the surface? Are you retaining the minerals? Different things to think through. Also, Matt, if this breaks up a property or spans your property in a way, is it something where you need an easement to be able to access other parts of the property so that you can get the benefit from it? I think there's lots of things to consider here that could be specific to the project itself.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, the other thing is, does it affect your water rights? Is this something where they're going to be using water as part of this on an ongoing basis, for cooling or, whatever? And then also the real key considerations for me are noise, pollution, odor, and then light. And you have to consider the proximity of the parcel that you're selling for the compressor station relative to the rest of your property and what you're using it for. If you have, let's say, a quarter section of land, or even let's say a quarter section of land. So that's basically a half mile by a half mile. And if they're putting it in the corner of your property and your house is on the complete opposite side of that, kind of the opposite corner of that quarter section, well, you're pretty far away from that compressor station. And if they put appropriate noise abatement and odor control and light, control in place, then it may be that it's, really not a bother, right? Particularly if the noise requirements from FERC are in place. We'll talk about the specific, decibel levels and, how that compares with normal conversation versus like an aircraft flying over and things like that, just to help you understand how noisy these things may or may not be. That could play a lot into it versus if the tract that they're wanting to buy obviously is like right next to where your house is. Well, that's a whole different, conversation and consideration. And maybe that's a non-starter, right? It's just way too close for comfort and, is going to be a nuisance, and potentially a big negative impact to the value of your home. So there's all of those considerations. But, there's other things too. I think when you talk about an industrial facility in general, whether it's oil and gas or other facilities, the question is, obviously you want these things to be environmentally sound, but what happens if there is a small leak or a spill or some contamination? Whose responsibility is it? Justin, you want to talk about some of the considerations there and other types of restrictions that maybe we would want to place on these types of sales?
Yeah, and for this type of sale, like you mentioned, Matt, if this is, let's say, on a section that's far enough away from you that it's just not immediately a non-starter, there are things that you can do, things to consider, things that you can negotiate, such as screening, buffering, building trees, covering it, making sure the sound abatement is there, making sure that it's contained. It's, not uncommon in both surface use agreements or really anything that oil and gas operators are doing to do some kind of remediation to the surface to ensure that different expectations are met by the landowner. And then, Matt, you mentioned the liability side. I think it's worth mentioning, even in a selling situation with the purchase of this property, that they're assuming all liability for any potential cleanups, both now and then. There's other things too to think about in that. What about the next person who owns this property? Is this going to be purchased and sold between operators? Are those protections going to survive? And then what is the lifetime of this project? Or what are they expecting it to be, at least?
Yeah, those are really good points. And, I think those types of restrictions are important. And, like we always say, if it's not in writing, it basically doesn't exist. And particularly if something's sold, like Justin mentioned, to another company, and you have a verbal agreement with the original midstream company or something like that, that won't survive that transfer. And so you need to be very careful about what protections you have in place, and that they're in writing and that they're enforceable. And then, one consideration, of course, is, how much you're able to sell the property for. And that obviously is going to play a big part into the decision, I would think, because you have these trade-offs of these negative outcomes and negative considerations, but then the positive outcome is getting potentially a good chunk of money. And, I don't know what the going rate is, right? That's probably very much dependent on where the property is located. But one consideration is that because of them approaching you to put the compressor station there's a reason for that. It's because they need to place the compressor station they need to put compressor stations a certain distance apart, roughly, let's say 40 to 100 miles, just depending on the use and the terrain and all of those things. And, they're coming to you because your property is located in the optimum location for that compressor station. Now, if they can't come to terms with you, they would probably go to try to buy property nearby. It doesn't have to be exactly on your land, so don't think that you're the only game in town. But what I'm trying to say is that you have a certain level of power in that negotiation to negotiate maybe above market value for that land, because it's going to benefit them greatly to put it in your location, because they have limited alternatives potentially, depending on the terrain. Again, maybe you are the only game in town because you're the only flat piece of land within, in a valley, and the pipeline goes up and down two mountains. Well, they need to find a property in that valley, and going north or south, if it's a pipeline that runs east-west, is going to mean that it's too expensive to reroute the pipeline to that other location. So you might have a little more negotiating power. So that's where getting things like the line diagrams and the plats and the right-of-way information about where that pipeline is going can be helpful in your negotiation, and getting someone that's familiar with those types of things to look at that and help you with that negotiation. And that could be getting an independent landman on your side to help you with the negotiation, in addition to your attorney to help you review any agreements. But again, this compensation for a compressor station, it should be substantial. We're talking usually about 10 to 20 acres of land, probably, and in that range, whatever the going rate is for surface land, consider that you ought to be negotiating based on asking for a premium well above that. But let's talk about the nuisance aspects of that property. Maybe they're offering you, well above market price. It seems like it's a windfall. It's great. What are the things we need to be thinking about as far as the consequences of having a compressor station surrounding or near your property?
You mentioned some of them, Matt, but the noise is definitely of top concern, and then emissions and odors are of top concern. Compressor stations, they're running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's not an occasional noise. It's going to be constant. And the FERC regulations, as you mentioned, Matt, the noise level could be no greater than 55 decibels day and night average to the closest, most noise-sensitive area. That certainly helps, and will keep it from being too noisy. But if you're in an area that's not regulated by FERC, it becomes a question of, okay, what does the municipality say about noise ordinances? What does the state say about the noise ordinances? What does the landowner want? So, Matt, that's an interesting thing to consider. And then the engines that are going to power the natural gas compressors, they're going to emit exhaust. And that is something worth considering. And, Matt, not something you necessarily want in your back door, as we mentioned, but it's worth considering. And then also, what are the ordinances and the regulations surrounding with emissions? And what are they doing there to ensure that they're maintaining those and they're being enforced?
Yeah, and that could be a thing where, that rotten egg smell with natural gas, you would probably have a little bit of that. They're, depending on the type of facility, they may have to inject those chemical compounds. And so that smell, may be a faint smell, but it could be something you would get near that facility. And then noise level, I think, just to put it in perspective, the FERC requires that noise level can be no greater than 55 decibels day or night average sound level. So that means that it can be higher for periods of time and then, lower. And so, but just to put that in perspective, just this decibel level comparison chart, household refrigerator is typically around 55 decibels. So it's not incredibly loud, but you have to consider that maybe when, something cycles on or cycles off, it could be a lot louder than that. So maybe it's closer to like the sound of city traffic for a short period of time, and then it goes down and it's silent, or, at a lower level, below 55. So I think when you think about this, if you're in a remote area that is completely silent at night, it's sort of like moving to the city is the way I would put this. Is you have that very faint level of road noise or traffic noise or just that kind of background noise that would exist. That would be like a suburban area or maybe an urban area at night. A constant level of slight noise that's probably not noticeable to most people, but depending on if you moved out there and you value complete silence and quiet, then that's a consideration as well. But that, it's not super loud. And again, if you can put things in place to protect the decibel level and standards, and, it depends on your jurisdiction too. It may be that your local county has rules that require certain noise levels. And so that's another thing to consider is, what are the local government requirements for these types of facilities and, what protections they have in place from the adjacent landowner perspective, around sound and noise and then also odor and the light pollutions type of thing. Interestingly, there was a Texas compressor station that was cited for an odor violation, and it was described as overpowering, highly objectionable, and nausea-inducing. And actually, surrounding property owners sued the company and won a $1.9 million lawsuit in damages for the diminution in property value and nuisance. So, that's another consideration is, what's the impact on the property value of your property and then also your neighbors, because that's one thing that, if you have a good relationship with your neighbors and you agree to sell to, an oil company to put a compressor station at the edge of your land, what's your adjacent neighbor think? Because it's going to impact them almost as much as you in that situation. And so you want to make sure that you're considering that too, because there could be some negative relationship outcomes if, they're totally opposed to the compressor station and you allow it to happen. So, I think there's the property values, the remaining land, is it going to be less? And then you have to consider that with the amount that you're getting from selling the property. And is that going to offset the decrease in property value from the remaining land as well?
Yeah, I think that's a big consideration, Matt. And you mentioned before that we should be looking for an above market value offer on this land. And I think you hit a nail on the head for a great reason why. If this is going to really, let's say that this is a part of the land that you don't live on, but however, maybe you do have other parts of the land you do live on, how is that going to affect the other property you're left owning? Is that something you need to be compensated for? Is that something you can negotiate with? Matt, homeowners living near a compressor station in New York saw a 20 to 50% decrease in property value assessment. And Matt, even if it's contained, we're following regulations, there's still the public perception of folks wanting to live near that. I think it's funny. I have family in West Texas, and kind of the prevailing thought there is, oh, well, as long as the pump jack's been there a while, you're okay. But in different parts of the world, like New York, I think that could be perceived very different.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of considerations that go into that. We were actually driving through North Park in Colorado. So that's between, say, northwest of Walden, Colorado, going to Steamboat Springs, and driving through there's been some oil and gas drilling, and you see pump jacks and kind of the normal stuff that we're used to. But then another thing there is because there aren't natural gas pipelines to take away the natural gas, they put in Bitcoin mining at these surface facilities. And so, there's sound issues with that, right? So there's, considerations that are maybe beyond just compressor stations. If they're looking at, and I think you could probably extend this into like putting in a data center or putting in, some Bitcoin mining on the well pad, and things to consider with like the leasing side of things, like, so the surface use type of a thing. And, as these things become more prevalent, then, becoming aware of the trade-offs, is helpful. And then, when you have your attorney help you negotiate the agreement, they can help you make sure that you have protections in place for those outcomes that you don't want to happen. And so I think that's a good transition to this last section here around the legal structure, and then working with an attorney. You want to talk about some of the things to consider when you're looking for an attorney, and then some of the terms maybe that we want to add to these types of agreements.
You want to speak with an oil and gas attorney that has experience in this industry and hopefully the area as well. Even better if they have experience with the companies doing this. You need to protect yourself. You really need to understand what it is you're selling. So some key contract terms to ensure, whether you're leasing or selling. Do you have the precise legal description? Are the boundaries very well specified? What exactly are the permitted uses? Indemnification for environmental and cleanup, noise, as we've talked about, buffering requirements, mediation or remediation requirements for the land, access restrictions, and all kinds of other things that go with it. Something that we mentioned earlier, Matt, is are you selling the minerals with this land? Are you going to sever the minerals? And then what is going to be the impact on adjacent land and adjacent land values?
Yeah, those are really good points. And I want to highlight one thing in particular, the screening and buffering requirements. That's where you can really help mitigate some of those negative impacts that we talked about. You can require that they put in berms, maybe beyond what the environmental regulations would require. And that could be for both sound and sight lines, and then also putting tree lines in and fencing. So you can make it so that it looks like just a line of trees from a distance, and that'll help block some of the light as well, because these types of things are industrial facilities. So there's going to be some lights, 24/7, or at least at nighttime. I would expect to have that facility lighted, so be lit up. And if that's used to be completely dark and you value the, not looking, off your porch and seeing blinding lights, then, a berm and tree lines and other things like that, that'll grow and block that. Both the sound and the light would be a good thing to add. And then I think also is, the abandonment and reclamation, obviously, from what happens when it's done, but then also when it's being constructed, might be helpful, particularly if they're accessing your land via a road or driveway or something, that you could add potentially some things around having them do road maintenance or road improvements, or replacing fences and things that they're going to disturb. And then dust control is a big thing as well, as they're doing construction and you have heavy equipment moving in and out, making sure that they're taking care of all those things. And again, there may be a lot of that's covered by the county ordinances and things like that and the building code. But, if not, then you definitely want to make sure you have those in place. And then finally, the tax planning side of things is also a really important thing before you sign on the dotted line, to make sure that you understand what the implications are from a tax perspective, because getting a windfall, from selling a piece of property at above market rate, well, there's going to be some tax implications, right? So you have to make sure that you're factoring that into, your overall tax picture. And, is that something that's going to make the right sense for you? And then, I think that just wrapping this up, there are other considerations out there. And of course, all this is very fact specific and depending on where you're located. And so, I will say, just to circle back to the question that Cheryl wrote in, and Cheryl, in your particular case, where you're wanting to know about the specifics, you really need to sit down, with your family and think about what is important to you and what are your considerations. Is this something you want to pursue? We're walking through sort of the general guidelines or general information, but obviously every situation is very different, and what makes sense for one family might not make sense for another. So you just have to look at it from the lens of what your goals are and what you want to do, and is it going to get you closer to those goals? And then like we said, I think getting help in this situation is extremely important. Getting an independent appraisal of the land before negotiating a price, understanding what you're being asked to sell or lease, and then, putting the right terms in place with that agreement, and that it will survive the sale of that property to another company in the future. That is another thing. And maybe that's putting it something in the deed or something that would be of record in the county, not just an actual agreement that would potentially get lost or maybe forgotten about. And then finally, of course, getting your CPA and attorney to help you through that whole process. But at the end of the day, I think you have more leverage than you might think, especially if you are in a very desirable location for placing that compressor station. And so that is something where you have some leverage. Use that to get the terms that you're going to be comfortable living with, and to get a good price. And then we got some interesting information. Actually, Penn State Extension, there's a really good article or webpage that they have about understanding natural gas compressor stations. So highly recommend that. And then there's some technical stuff out there from companies that are involved in the industry, like Kimray, and they have how a gas compressor station works. And so you can see, what does it look like? What is that going to be, on your property if you agree to this on the dotted line? What are we talking about when we're talking about a compressor station from a visual aspect? So all that's, those are helpful resources. And again, we'll link to those in the show notes, as well as the narrow membership coupon code, which is super helpful. And in this case is, I think, invaluable because as a narrow member, you get access to a list of high quality service providers in the industry, including attorneys. So if you don't have an oil and gas attorney, that might be a good way to get some names that you can contact and do some interviewing to find out if they can help you with your the sale of your land for this particular use case. So, Justin, any other advice you would give to anyone facing this situation?
I think you've wrapped it up well, Matt. I think in a situation like this, working with good counsel is really important. Finding somebody who has some experience can be really useful, and making sure that you kind of cross the T's and dot the I's when you're going through a situation like this. It's something where you're not just selling the land, there's implications beyond that need to be considered. And that answer is going to be individual to each person. Yeah,
that's great. Great advice. So I think that's a good place to wrap this up. So thanks again for listening. And thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.